I am now on the MTK hotline, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to the Mop Tops and the King, the author of the fabulous book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. He's also the resident rock and roll historian of the show. From the north of England, Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome back to the Mop Tops and the King.
Oh, hi there, Steve. It's great to be back. Really looking forward to this particular topic. It's really interesting.
Yes, I am too. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. So today, we're going to be discussing one of the more controversial topics in the Elvis world, and that's the relationship between Elvis and his manager, the Colonel Tom Parker. But before we do, I know you've seen the movie. I've seen it too, the movie Elvis. What'd you think of the film?
I thought it was a great film. As a movie, I thought it was great. The acting was great. The likenesses were incredible. I actually enjoyed the soundtracks, though I have seen some criticism of that. It was a great story, a very bad baddie, a very talented, hapless, exploited young man. But I think as a look at the relationship between Elvis and the Colonel, it was very two-dimensional, very biased against the Colonel. I mean, there was no talk of Bob Neal, his first manager. I mean, Bob Neal was still managing Elvis officially when the Colonel signed him to RCA, for instance. It was a great film.
Yeah, I thought some of the recreations were fantastic. All right, so one of the things in the movie is that the Colonel, played by Tom Hanks, says, "Without me, there would be no Elvis Presley." Now, so that's a pretty bold statement, and we'll never know the answer. So I want to ask you, what do you think that Elvis's career might have looked like if, for one, he never met the Colonel, or somewhere down the line they parted ways, either in the 50s, 60s, or 70s? You know, what do you think it might have looked like?
Well, I think it's a really interesting thought that. In the 1950s, I mean, Scotty Moore, the guitarist, was Elvis's first official manager. Bob Neal took over from him. But Bob Neal was very Memphis-centric. He had a record store there. He was a DJ. He booked gigs in that area. I mean, Elvis had 5 Sun singles at that time before he hit big with RCA, 4 of which were, 5 singles, 10 sides. 4 of those sides were actually Billboard country hits. So without the Colonel in the 50s, he might well have become a country singer who had some crossover hits. And then if you look quickly at the 1960s, again, without the Colonel, or if the Colonel had left at the end of the 50s, he would probably have been swept away in 1964 by the British invasion, as were pretty much all of his contemporaries from the 1950s. I mean, that was when after the Beatles, when the British beat groups came over and dominated the American music scene for a couple of years. He'd still have been famous. But I think if you look at the 70s rather, if he didn't emerge from the late 60s, at least as big as he was in the 50s, to be honest, it wouldn't really have mattered who was managing him. He would have been famous, you know, in the way that Johnny Cash is famous, but he wouldn't be the legend that he is now. I mean, a couple of people in the frame to manage him, certainly in the 60s, would be Albert Grossman, who managed Janis Joplin, Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary and the likes. And, of course, Alan Klein, who famously managed the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But that didn't end very well for either of them.
We're speaking with Derek Shelmerdine. He's the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. Derek, so do you think the strategy, or even if it was a strategy in the 60s, just to make movies and just to ride out the British invasion, do you think in the end that was probably a brilliant strategy, or do you think it was just by accident?
Well, I think there was a combination of a couple of things. I mean, the Colonel did a brilliant job in the 1950s, and if you like, an even better job when for the 2 years that Elvis was away, he managed to keep Elvis in the front of everybody's mind. But when Elvis came out of the army, I mean, he was the king of rock and roll, but there was no rock and roll to be king of anymore. In America, the music scene changed dramatically. You had soul music with Atlantic Records, Motown, dance crazes, Chubby Checker, The Twist, and a host of others. Rock and roll was now a bunch of very young teen idols like Fabian and Frankie Avalon. By the time we get to about 1962, I mean, the music scene had changed absolutely out of recognition. And what the Colonel did around that sort of time, he became the snowman again. He created something out of nothing. He didn't create Elvis. What he created was the environment where Elvis wasn't competing against the Beatles, the Stones, and Dylan. And then, of course, in the mid-'60s, you had the British invasion. If he'd survived that, Elvis would have had to have reinvented himself again in the mid-'60s when rock music broke on both sides of the Atlantic. And we had the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Clapton, The Doors, psychedelic music. So I think the Colonel's strategy, and it was a deliberate strategy, for no personal appearances, and mostly, nearly all movie music, all based around the 1960s movies. And what was great about that was to see Elvis, you had to go to the movies. To hear Elvis, you had to buy the songs from the films. Right. It was perpetual motion. The movies generated the songs, the hit singles sustained the movies. Only problem would be if the hits fell by the wayside, but they didn't. And Elvis kept in the charts with the lots of hit singles right across the 60s, and all the movies made money.
Derek, I want to thank you so much for coming on. We're going to pick it up the next episode because there's just too much to talk about here about Elvis's relationship with the Colonel. So we're going to pick you up next time on the Mop Tops and the King. It's a pleasure speaking with you today, Derek.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. I really enjoyed it, Steve.
I am now on the MTK hotline, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to the show the author of the book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, and the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King from the north of England. Welcome back to the show, Derek Shelmerdine.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be back talking about Elvis and the Colonel again.
It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. So last time you were on the show, you were talking about what might have been if Elvis never met the Colonel or if they parted ways. But one thing I did not get to ask you, in your opinion, do you think the Colonel, with respect to being Elvis's manager, was more of a hero or more of a villain, as a lot of Elvis fans think he was?
Well, I'm very much down the road that the Colonel was the best thing that ever happened to Elvis. I think he's very, very much a hero. I mean, he had his faults. I mean, was he a really nice guy? Would you want to go out for a drink with him? Probably not. Was he the best thing that probably ever happened to Elvis in terms of management? I can't see how anybody could have been more successful in turning Elvis into the legend that he is, to be honest.
Very interesting. I know, because I'm a member of a lot of Facebook groups, Elvis groups, and the Colonel just does not get a lot of love on those sites. Now, there's lots of talk that, of course, that the Colonel kept Elvis from doing a world tour. Elvis is quoted as saying quite a few times that he wanted to tour England, Europe, and Japan. He never got the chance. What do you think about that?
That's absolutely a matter of fact, isn't it? It could well be. I mean, the Colonel was technically an illegal immigrant. He had no passport, so it would have been difficult for him to go. And he was an inveterate gambler. There's absolutely no two ways about that. So wanting to be in Vegas was very much understandable. Was it a problem for Elvis? I don't think so. In the 60s and 70s, rock and roll bands touring lost money on the tours, and they made the money selling the records. And Elvis was making $1 million, by today's standards, he was making $1 million a week for his 4-week residencies in Vegas. And what's interesting, if you think about the movie, towards the end, Elvis collapses just doing local tours. So Elvis's health may have been a little bit of a problem as well if he'd gone on what would be a very grueling world tour. And Elvis made more money by just doing the Vegas tours than he did if he'd gone on a world tour, because of course he had no expenses, and the fans who wanted to see him all went to see him. So I think from Elvis's point of view, he was much better off not having to tour the world.
Right. I know that in the movie and elsewhere, things that I've read, the Colonel convinced Elvis, instead of you going around the world, let's bring the world to you. And that's how he convinced him to do the Aloha concert and stay in Vegas and have the world come to Vegas to see Elvis.
What's also interesting is it was those Elvis residencies that were the actual mold for what is now the modern Vegas model. for the cabaret acts. They were just a loss leader before Elvis. They were just something that casinos like to put on. But it was very much the Colonel that's changed the face of the Vegas residencies.
We are speaking with Derek Shelmerdine. He's the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. He's also the author of the book Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. Before we let you go, this famous contract between Elvis and the Colonel, 50%. Was that unheard of at the time?
It was unusual to be that high. I think two things to bear in mind, though. One was Elvis was the Colonel's only client, unlike every other manager on the face of the earth. And also, he was an absolute brilliant negotiator. He negotiated very, very high, unusually high fees for Elvis. And he also continually renegotiated better and better deals with RCA and the movie companies. He also created merchandising, the modern concept of merchandising. He even had "I Hate Elvis" pins to get money out of people that didn't like Elvis.
That was funny in the movie when they showed that.
Oh, I thought that was great. And I mean, the Guinness Book of World Records, has Elvis as the best-selling solo artist of all time with 1 billion units sold. And what the Colonel was really good at, he kept the fans always wanting more, always coming back. I cannot see the Colonel in any shape or form as holding Elvis back. I personally don't really see how Elvis could be any bigger in legend than he is today.
Yeah.
I mean, there are 85,000 Elvis impersonators around, apparently.
On that note, Derek Shelmerdine, thank you so much for coming back on the Mop Tops and the King. It's always a pleasure, and I want to remind people they can learn more about you. You want to tell us your website?
Yeah, I've got a website at rock'n'rollunravelled.com.
Derek Shelmerdine, thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, that's great, Steve. Great to talk to you as always. And you have a great day, mate.